Good afternoon. Welcome to the weekly livestock market update. I'm Brownfield anchor reporter Megan Grebner. With us, as always, to talk all things markets is University of Missouri Scott Brown. Good afternoon, Scott.
Good afternoon, Megan.
As we get things going today, the big report this week, cattle on feed, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But to kick things off, let's recap what happened this week in the markets.
Yeah, on the cattle side this week, cash cattle about 50 cents lower this week. Feeder cattle auctions were anywhere from $2 to $5 lower this week. Looking at the futures side, June live cattle futures were down $3.50 on the week. And those May feeder cattle futures, they were down $5.60 this week. You know, you look at what was a nearly 70-cent increase in May corn futures, and I think that certainly hurt the cattle complex for the week. Choice box beef prices were actually higher, up about $7 this week on what was strength across the board. On the hog side, cash barrel and gilt prices were up nearly $2. The June lean hog futures contract was up $4 this week, and the pork cutout value continued to rise, up $3.30 on the week.
I have a feeling those corn prices and what's going on with corn prices is going to be a consistent topic for us over the next few weeks and coming months.
Absolutely, so I think some bad weather certainly got us part of what was going on this week, and put a couple weeks behind us of good weather, and we might be on the other side of where these prices have been of late.
And we'll talk a little bit more about that too coming up a little bit. Let's look at slaughter numbers. I think we should probably, before we look at these numbers and talk about the comparison to a year ago, remind folks that we were in the height of the slowdown and shutdowns a year ago, and it's really going to skew some data and information and numbers as we look at some year-over-year comparisons.
Yeah, that's right. If you look at cattle slaughter for the week ending April 24th, USDA is estimating 665,000 head of cattle to be slaughtered. It's actually up 25,000 head from where we were a week ago, or about 4%. But when you look at it relative to a year ago, it's up 195,000 head. So a big growth relative to a year ago. And again, that's all relative to COVID-19 from a year ago. On the hog side, 2.473 million head of hogs slaughtered this week, really unchanged from where we were a week ago, but 482,000 head more hogs slaughtered this week than where we were a year ago.
Let's talk cold storage numbers as we dig into those reports from this week. And really interesting as we look at how much is in cold storage.
Yeah, so we continue to get good news of tight freezer stocks, if you will, in both beef and pork, that I think, to me, again, reminds us that demand has been fairly strong. It's certainly more positive on the pork side maybe than what we saw on beef. But when you look at March freezer stocks on the beef side, we were down about 4% relative to where we were a year ago at this time. On the pork side, though, down 27%. Relative to where we were a year ago at this time, so much tighter pork stocks generally. And you can look at some of those individual pieces. Belly freezer stocks were just 35.3 million pounds at the end of March. That's down 55% relative to where we were a year ago. So very, very tight. It just reminds me that demand continues to be strong. And again, I'd remind us that we haven't been seeing the same kinds of increase in production that we generally have been seeing. Again, I should be careful about saying that when we're comparing to COVID-19 levels of a year ago.
My question is, when we look at the demand picture, all demand is not equal, correct? So we're seeing tighter belly supplies, but are we seeing that same kind of demand strength for loins or hams, for example? And if we're not, do we need to figure out a way to boost demand for those products as well?
So we aren't as tight in loins as we have been in bellies, that's for sure. And we certainly haven't seen the same increases. I will say, if hog producers want higher prices than where we sit today, finding out ways to get higher loin prices could certainly be helpful. If you look back, the worst of COVID-19, we did see loin prices above $1, and I think that had a lot to do with more preparation at home. Finding out better ways to use things like loins, again, I think is a winning strategy for the industry. And yes, bacon's the hot item, as you and I both know, that we consume our fair share, but you need to pull up all those boats, if you will, if you want higher cutout values down the road.
A rising tide lifts all boats in all
That's
things.
right.
All right, let's talk livestock slaughter and production numbers as we look at the beef and pork side of things.
Yeah, again, we're going to want to be a little careful with these, but March 21 beef production was up 2.9% relative to where we were a year ago. Just to keep us focused here for a minute, by the way, it's up 17% relative to where it was in March of 2019. On the hog side, we were actually down in pork production, 0.7% this in March of 21 relative to a year ago. But even in that case, it's 11% higher than where we were in March of 19. If we look particularly at some of the data that maybe sticks out, beef cow slaughter. So after the first couple of months of being down in beef cow slaughter relative to year ago levels, in March we were up 27,000 head relative to where we were in 2020, which has pretty much put us on a similar track on slaughter of beef cows relative to where we were a year ago.
When we look at that number, I'm assuming not signaling expansion, but are we going to continue to monitor that as we see drought conditions in parts of cattle country? And then also, as we talked about earlier, those higher corn prices and potentially what weather could happen throughout the growing season.
Yeah, so to me, there's a lot of reason to be concerned at the cow-calf level right now. First, just the drought discussion. So that whole area in the West hasn't really changed. It's been deep, dark red, and that's bad when we look at the drought monitor. And it hasn't really changed. For me now, you can look up in the Dakotas, and it continues to also have those areas that are pretty tough in terms of drought conditions. We're getting to the point in time where we need that to be better, right? We need to grow some grass in some parts of this country. So I think that could affect beef cow numbers moving forward. Now, two things I think happen. Number one, we start to move cows around as well in terms of where we have better grass. So that's part of it. You look at those feeder cattle prices, though, and those also have some folks concerned, and we keep pushing corn prices higher. It makes it tough not to talk about even lower feeder cattle prices as we look ahead.
All right, the big report today, cattle on feed numbers. And when you look at that placement number, it's a little shocking, but then we also have to consider where we were a year ago.
Yeah, so let's start with the range of the pre-report estimates for placed in March. It was from 128% higher to 143.4. So a big wide range. And in fact, if you look, the report came in at 128.3. That's towards the low end of that pre-report guess, but we didn't place a lot of cattle a year ago because of COVID-19. You look at on feed April 1, USDA says that came in at 105.3, also at the low end of the pre-report estimates on feed numbers as well. So, frankly, continuing to say reasonably tight relative to expectations in both placements as well as on feed numbers.
How does that play out to what we look at through the rest of the year? And we're going to talk about heifers as part of that as well. But in the big picture, where are we as we look ahead for the rest of this year?
Yeah, so we're going to have to be careful as we go month to month here on cattle on feed in particular, because we'll know we postponed placing some cattle here in March. We'll come back and placed heavier a year ago. So everybody's going to want to be really careful in that comparison, relative to a year ago for the next several months. I think I continue to say we're in a situation where placements and on feed are giving us more reasons to be optimistic as maybe supplies are in better shape than even we would have thought for this part of 2021.
Let's talk about that heifer number as we look at that. How closely will we continue to watch that, kind of like the beef cow slaughter number, but how much of a role is that going to play in and what we're looking at for the rest of 2021 and well into 2022 for cattle producers?
Yeah, so we get a chance to kind of look at what replacement heifer numbers look like because we can back those out of just how many heifers are we placing in the feed yard. When you look at the on-feed numbers of April 1, right at 38% of those were heifers. That puts that a percentage that tells me we're not certainly growing the herd, or we haven't held back a lot of replacement heifers. So as I look, the next 12 to 18 months, right now, nothing jumps out at me that says, oh, we're going to have a big slug of beef production or cattle slaughter coming as we look ahead. The combination of no pasture in some parts of the country, as well as lower feeder cattle prices, as we have higher corn prices, I think has certainly taken the polish off of some optimism that maybe we had earlier.
Scott, anything else this week?
I think we've covered the major issues for the week, Megan.
All right, as we look ahead to next week, what are some things that we're watching for and reports that we're monitoring?
So USDA will give us an annual meat animals report next week, and we'll finish next week with a restaurant performance index.
We get to see how demand is playing out.
Hopefully we see more opening and more good news on the demand side.
Scott, always great to see you. Enjoy your weekend. We'll talk to you next Friday.
That sounds great, Megan.
Our weekly livestock market update delivered your email box every Saturday morning. Visit our website, brownfieldagnews.com. You can also subscribe and submit questions and comments there. And for all the great Brownfield podcasts while you're in the cab of the tractor this spring, go to brownfieldagnews.com/podcast. Have a great weekend. I'm Megan Grebner for Brownfield.